All right, thanks everybody for joining. This paper and this project was really a very large collaborative effort among the three of us, as well as a much larger group. So this slide probably took the longest of any on this presentation, but I think as I was finding all of these pictures, I realized that all of the co-authors on this project are really passionate about being outside, probably very dorky, and we love looking at the woods and the forests. So I wanted to just, give you a sense of how big this project was. And it actually started with a special session at a landscape ecology conference. And really, Jonathan led this group in kind of thinking about conversions and how we synthesize the knowledge that we have so far on forest fire-driven conversions. So as I mentioned, this and as Xander said, this is going to be kind of a collaborative presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we mean by conversion and what drives it, or the mechanisms for conversion. Sean is going to discuss what we can expect in the future in this realm. And then Jonathan is going to end us with talking about the consequences and what we should do going forward as we think about these forest conversions across the landscape. So to get us started, we should kind of talk about and set the framework for what we mean by conversion. And this is a picture from the East Troublesome fire that happened here in Colorado that moved 6,000 acres an hour over the Continental Divide in September, early October, actually. So I think something that we have all been grappling with this year is that it has been a crazy fire year. If we can remember back to January, there were huge, massive wildfires in Australia. As we moved into our fire season, we saw a lot of the Southwest, especially those areas around Tucson, have some very extreme large fires. And then as we moved into this fall, we really saw quite an astonishing number of fires that really negatively impacted a lot of human populations in places like California and Oregon, as well as here in Colorado. And to give you a sense, these are numbers that I just took off of the National Interagency Fire Center. We had, to date, in 2020, we've had over 49,000 fires that have totaled over 8.7 million acres burned. But I think what's really important to understand is that even though these fires have been in the news and we've been really impacted by them, especially in these population centers, this number of acres burned is not even the most we've had in the last 5 years. So this is a potential for kind of a new normal of our landscapes. And as all these fires die down, certainly this group, but also I think people in general start worrying about what these ecosystems are going to look like going forward. What do we need to be concerned about? And how are they going to look next year, as well as for the rest of our lifetimes? So to give us a framework for how we can think about this, perhaps, the idea of resistance and resilience is one of those concepts that I think has made, there's been a lot of writing about it in lots of different systems, both natural systems and humans, kind of thinking about our resistant and resilient qualities. But this was in our paper for how we framed this concept. And so to orient you here, right, we have some large fire event, this initial large fire. And, there's going to be a certain degree of ecological change in this system following a fire event like this, where a lot of the trees are going to die. And then we have this post-fire landscape. So this post-fire landscape immediately after the fire probably looks very different than that ecosystem did pre-fire. But the question is, how are these ecosystems going to look as we move to decades to centuries later? And so if it's a resilient system, the idea is that you have a decent amount of recovery in these ecosystems, right? These are obviously areas that have burned, but we see a lot of tree regeneration happening on these landscapes. And, over the scale of 50 to 100 years, these will probably be mature forests again. On the other extreme, on these areas that are perhaps experiencing some sort of conversion. We could see perhaps these persistent transformations, which these pictures at the top. The picture on the left is from the 1988 Yellowstone fires taken by Dan Donato. And we see that even though this fire happened more than 30 years ago at this point, there's not any trees coming back on that landscape, kind of indicating that at least in the moderate term, we're probably looking at a consistent conversion. This other picture, as you can see from the dead standing trees in the background, was a forest, but now it's a really large shrub-dominated landscape. And there's also a possibility that perhaps these ecosystems will eventually recover. So we're perhaps not seeing them. They may not happen in our lifetimes, but they might recover to some similar ecosystem that was there prior to this fire. For this point, I thought this picture of a tiny Douglas fir seedling underneath the new regrowth of Gamble oak kind of demonstrated that well. Even though this landscape is now predominantly Gamble oak dominated, it might perhaps recover to a forest at some point in the future. So broadly, this all gets to how many of these ecosystems will respond to a disturbance and what might limit the recovery and how they will recover into the future. So again, to kind of give you some visuals, right? We have this big ecosystem changing event, this fire, and we're looking at this post-fire landscape wondering if it's going to recover, or are we going to transition into a different ecosystem type or perhaps experience a conversion. So the way that we defined conversion in this paper was a major, extensive, and enduring change in the dominant species, life forms, or functions with impacts on ecosystem services. So, we might all have, similar to the concepts of resistance and resilience, have different definitions of conversion in our mind, but this was the one that we went with in this paper, and that Jonathan did a lot of kind of background research and combining different people's perceptions of conversion for this paper. So I think the first key in understanding conversion is that we first need to lose that overstory or that mature forest vegetation, right? We're seeing a transition away from a forest because we've lost that canopy. And this can happen and is happening in part because we're seeing an increase in the number of high severity fires, the extent of those high severity patches. This also could be happening because of some compounding disturbance. Maybe that fire, it wasn't that extreme or it didn't have that high of intensity, but combined with the effects of drought or beetles or some previous fire, we see that loss of that overstory and that mature forest. And the key here is that, as this figure on the left demonstrates, is that we're seeing this conversion happening we're concerned about this conversion happening when we talk about those progressively larger landscapes, right? This top picture is looking at the Hayman fire, where we had these really large high severity patches here in Colorado in 2002. And that's going to have a very different impact on our concerns about conversion compared to this picture on the bottom, which is looking at a fairly small high severity patch. And as you can see in the background, there's lots of green trees and still plenty of vegetation there. And if you think about the forest that you're familiar with and that you've walked around in, we often have very few concerns about those small high severity patches that might serve as openings or meadows. It's really when we get these very large landscapes that that we've lost the tree cover that we become very concerned. All right, so we've lost those overstory trees. Say we're talking about that large landscape without any. There are multiple ways that we then have to look at that recovery process, right? And there are multiple mechanisms upon which these ecosystems are experiencing that might inhibit their recovery process back to a forest. So they could be something like those large high severity patches mean that you're really far from a seed source. It could be that repeated repeated fires are eliminating that pulse of regeneration that came after the first fire, or perhaps climate is reducing or constraining the establishment. And there are certainly lots of feedback mechanisms in this also, and I'll walk through all of these a little bit more so you have a sense of what we're talking about. So first, in terms of inhibiting this recovery, this lack of seed availability or propagules, right? This again is another picture from the Hayman fire, looking across this large expanse of 18 square miles of a high severity patch where there's hardly any to no seed sources. It's going to be really hard for a tree to naturally spread their seeds into this landscape, even if assuming everything else is great and that landscape is ready to recover. So this is something that many of us on this call and many fire ecologists have researched, is kind of what the distance that we see tree seedlings start to establish, or the kind of range that there is a possibility of establishment. This is from one study by Marion Chambers et al. In 2016, showing that the median distance of from a living tree to where they saw tree regeneration was about 64 meters. And this is pretty indicative for a lot of the studies kind of across the Western US, in that a lot of these conifers that we want to reestablish are not the best at dispersing their seeds across that landscape. So you really have to be close to a seed source. The next process that inhibits recovery is the ability, the probability of reburning. We see this really across North America. This is a picture from Canada where they've been seeing some really intense short interval reburns, which is particularly concerning in this landscape because a lot of that regeneration, it will come in within the first 5 or 10 years. And so if you're looking at these really fast reburns, you might end up in a landscape like this that has very little vegetation recovery, even if after the first fire, the regeneration looked fairly good. And we've seen this in other systems across the Western US, and this is probably becoming more and more prevalent as we have these larger fires that are bumping into one another. There's also climatic constraints, right? You could have all of the seed sources and the available seed, but if all of a sudden you are not, your particular site is not conducive to tree regeneration anymore, meaning that you're now experiencing hotter and drier conditions, or there's less, meaning that there's less probability of recruitment, you're going to see less trees. And this is from a paper by Kimberly Davis et al. In 2019, showing that, prior to 2000, there was a lot of windows with fairly high probabilities of recruitment, meaning that those climatic conditions were conducive to tree establishment and growth. But after 2000, as we've experienced more and more extreme climate change, we've seen this shift to less, fewer probability recruitment windows, and even those recruitment windows are fairly small. So finally, we have lots of potential for reinforcing feedback loops. This can be a number of things. This can be that combination of reburning and climate change. This can be a shift in vegetation, perhaps because of those shifting climate and disturbance regimes, right? If you're suddenly replacing a forest with a highly flammable shrub field, even if you happen to get a few trees establishing, it's going to be difficult to continue to see reestablishment if those fires persist and increase in frequency across that landscape because of that vegetation type shift. All right, so now I will hand it over to Sean.
Thank you, Camille. Appreciate it. And let's hope this works.
Sean, you're a little quiet. If maybe.
Okay, I will. And I also, my slides are probably switched. So if I do that, that might be better, right?
Yep.
Okay, great. And I'll turn up my microphone. So thanks, Camille, for that great introduction. And thanks to everyone who joined us today. And sorry for the technical difficulties at the beginning. But what I am going to talk about is what we might expect in the future under climate change. So oddly enough, when I talk about the future, when I start about the future, I'm going to actually go back to the past, the paleoecological record, just because it provides us with a great foundation in which to think about the future, because in the past we did have climate change, rapid climate change. And so here is basically some findings of a paper by Shelley Krausbe and colleagues. And what they found is that, not surprisingly, is under a stable climate, under a stable climate, basically fires would occur and the vegetation or forest would eventually lead back to what it was prior to the fire. And that's basically one of the things that Camille was talking about. But however, during rapid climate change, these forests were not resilient to fires, right? Fires catalyzed or triggered large scale changes. So basically this paleoecological record does provide us solid rationale and evidence that fires do act as a catalyst under climate change. And now that we are in the middle of a climate changing event, we should expect to see changes in the future. And that's basically what I'm going to be talking about. I will also say that this field of fire-driven conversions to non-forest, and particularly under climate change, is an extremely active area of research. This paper that Camille and Jonathan and I are talking about was published in midsummer, and there have been several papers since midsummer, since the bioscience paper, that have come out that are very relevant to this topic. So I not only get to talk about what was discussed in the paper and presented in the paper, but also some of the new studies that have been published since. So when we're thinking about climate change and fire, basically we've got a double whammy here, right? We're going to be seeing, and we are seeing, increasing high severity fire. And we're also seeing, and will continue to see, a climate that is increasingly unsuitable or unfavorable to the establishment and survival of seedlings. So both of these things are not so great for our forests. So in terms of high severity fire, here is a paper that was actually technically or published today. So this is kind of fun to present, by John Abotsoglu and I. And we looked at high severity fire over time from 1985 to 2007. This is area burned at high severity. And what we show is that there's been an 8-fold increase in area burned at high severity since 1985. And what's important here, three things are important. These increases in area burned at high severity are coincident with warmer and drier climates, or warmer and drier fire seasons. And annual area burned at high severity is highly correlated with that fire season climate. So if we expect fire season climates to warm, we're going to expect to see more high severity fire or more area burned at high severity. And also this relationship is nonlinear. There's an acceleration going on, which is telling, this study did not include 2020. 2020, by all accounts, was probably a record in terms of forest area burned, not total area burned, but forest area burned at high severity. So once we get the data at hand, it will be interesting to look at that. But high severity fire is important, as Camille was mentioning, because all things being equal, more high severity fire means larger distances or more area that is far from a viable seed source. Okay, and so as Camille was mentioning, the more area or the farther you are from a seed source, the more likely persistent conversions to alternative forest types or non-forest will be. So this idea of high severity fire is important. Here's actually a picture from this year from California, the Sierra Nevadas. The big trees there are giant sequoias, a very fire adapted tree. Yet this particular photo shows that some of these, or all the giant sequoias in this tree died, right? So it's hard to imagine, unless there's a seed source nearby, that the giant sequoias are going to return this area, unless they're planted or something like that. So you know, not only is area burn at high severity increasing, but just area burned is increasing. As area burned increases, and we expect it to increase in the future, we're going to see more short interval reburning. Camille also talked about that. Short interval reburning is often stresses our forest systems. Now, here's another paper published by Caitlin Littlefield and colleagues. This was published just last week in PNAS, but they showed that basically there's a dipole, or you know, basically when the conditions are favorable to regeneration in the north, they're not favorable to regeneration in the south, and vice versa, right? This dipole has been highlighted before in other publications, but Caitlin and colleagues tied this to post-fire recovery, so it's interesting. And one of the things they noted was that you know, in normal or stable climates, you know, there's going to be alternating pulses of suitable and unsuitable conditions, or seesaw, between the north and the south of the Intermountain West. But as those pulses are overlaid on directional warming, at some point, the pulse is basically irrelevant, and the conditions suitable to regeneration are not good or unfavorable in the north and the south as we warm. So these are all the issues that need to be considered as we think about the future and the future of our forests, especially, you know, after fire. So you all know that the climate is warming, right? On the left here basically shows the Western United States, the climatic water deficit from terraclimate under a historical reference period and a 2C warming. So the air bars show the annual variability under each of those. So yes, we expect more warming, and we're all aware of that. But just to put it all home, to put it all together here, more warming temperatures should equal more fire. More fire means more short interval reburns. Camille talked about why that's a problem for forests. Continued warming would mean more high severity fire. And then we have more area that exceeds these critical dispersal thresholds, seed dispersal thresholds. And lastly, more warming means that seedlings are less likely to establish and survive. So when it's all said and done, we basically have an erosion of forest resilience, or an increased probability that fire will catalyze shifts to alternative forest types or non-forest conditions. I'm going to run through a few papers here that actually provide projections. Note that a lot of these papers, looked at lots of GCMs, they looked at lots of different emissions scenarios and what have you. So I did my best to kind of summarize you know, kind of the average conditions of what these papers suggest. So here's a paper from the Sierra Nevada from Lang et al. Showing that fire and climate change is expected to reduce forest extent by about 6% by the end of this century. You know, and you know, just experiencing year 2020, I'm wondering if the average value I'm mentioning here, 6%, is an underestimate, and if we should be looking at some of their more extreme climate scenarios for forest loss in the Sierra Nevada. Oh, going the wrong way here. Okay, here's another one by myself and colleagues from that was published last year, looking at fire and climate change in the Intermountain Western U.S. And what we did is we looked at what we consider trailing edge forests, areas that are currently forest that we think are going to be climatically unsuitable to forest by mid-century. And we intersected that with stand replacing fire. Remember that stand replacing fire is actually the first ingredient in these conversions, right? A low severity or a surface fire is unlikely to drive widespread conversions from forest to different forest types or to non-forest. So the key here is stand replacing fire is super important. So anyway, when you look at these two maps and basically intersect them, we showed that across the entire study area, about 6.6% of forest is at risk to conversion. In the southwestern US, we were able to tweak our model a little bit and look at extreme fire weather and its effects on the potential for fire catalyzed conversion. And we showed that about 30% of forest areas at risk to conversion by mid-century in the southwestern US. Here's another paper by Kimberly Davis and colleagues. This is also a brand new one. It's published in the last month or month and a half. And they did the same thing. They looked at maps of high severity fire, or where they thought high severity fire would occur, and intersected it with basically this post-fire recruitment index, or what areas are going to be suitable for successful seedling establishment. And what Kim Davis and colleagues found was that 16% of ponderosa pine and 10% of Douglas fir forests are vulnerable to this fire catalyzed conversion under a 2C warming scenario. Here's another paper or study from the Kaibab Plateau in northern Arizona by Flatley and Foulet. And, depending on the forest type and climate scenario, up to 49% of the landscape is predicted to convert to non-forest by 2090. Here is another one from the Klamath region, Northern California, Southern Oregon, in which Sarah Diaz and colleagues showed that about 1/3 of the conifer-dominated forests could transition to other types, including shrub or hardwood-dominated ecosystems. And again, this is triggered by not only an increase in fire activity, but it's coupled with the idea that post-fire, or the climate is becoming increasingly inconducive to seedlings successfully taking hold. Here's just a couple more here. Here's another one by Campbell and Shinman from central Idaho. There's a lot of species and a lot of scenarios here, but the take-home message here is that basically climate change and fire activity are expected to reduce the prevalence of some of the more common, or some of the most common conifer species in central Idaho. All right, here's our only one from Canada. So it's nice to have one from Canada, from Deanna Strahlberg and colleagues. Basically, again, show that fire is expected to catalyze conversion of about 50% of the mixed conifer and conifer forests to other types, including grassland, shrubland, and deciduous woodlands by the end of the century. And this is the last one, I promise. This is, again, a brand new one by Kyle Rodman and colleagues, just published in the last month or two or three, but it's the same story. Basically, warm and dry post-fire conditions are not conducive to seedling establishment, right? So when you plot your climate change models on top of that, what we see is continued warming basically reduces the prevalence of these seedlings. So, I want to point out there's a lot of ifs, ands, or buts and uncertainties with a lot of these projections, right? We don't know exactly when, we don't know exactly where, and we don't know exactly how much forest will be converted to alternative forest types or to non-forest. But, there's a lot of evidence out there. We've got evidence from the paleoecological record. We've got evidence that we're just seeing right now with our own eyes. And we've got evidence from these projections, these studies that project into the future. So we're fairly confident, in basically saying that there's going to be some substantial, and there currently are substantial changes to our forests, and we should expect to see basically some of these conversions unfold across landscapes in the Western North America as climate change continues. I'm going to hand it off to Jonathan Coop here, because he's going to talk about how society should respond to these conversions.
Okay, thanks Sean and Camille, and thanks Xander for letting me into the webinar. So yeah, I'm going to pick up sort of where Sean left off, and think through sort of some possible options for how we might approach land management in this era of change. And just to reiterate that last point from Sean, given everything we know, we can anticipate a lot more of these kinds of changes. And it's pretty likely that what we're seeing right now, and what we've seen so far, really just represents the tip of the iceberg as far as what's to come. So we'll talk a little bit about the consequences of conversion here and what we might do about them, both as scientists and managers. Okay, first of all, what happens when the forest doesn't come back, or the forest that was there doesn't come back? So in Western North America, we are primarily focused on conifer forests with some different types of potential alternative ecological outcomes if those forests, like ponderosa pine forests in the Southwest, prove to not be able to return under contemporary or future conditions. So one might be alternate forest types, and certainly we're seeing conversion of conifer forests to aspen or other populous generally up in the far north. We can also anticipate conversions to non-forest shrub-dominated vegetation, as illustrated by that picture on the far, those two slides on the far right from Central California or coastal California and the Chiricahua Mountains of Arizona, and also shifts towards herbaceous vegetation or grassy or forb-dominated plant communities. So I think this is another area of some interesting potential research. What are the potential ecological outcomes at any given site, which of course are going to depend on what's there already and also what can get in there. And one concern that is abundantly apparent is the shift towards non-native species like cheatgrass. Okay, any of these changes in vegetation type necessarily carry consequences to ecosystem function and biodiversity. This is a shot from the Hayman burn again. So big changes to carbon storage and carbon uptake, but also we think a lot about carbon, but it's also important to think about other climate or forest forcings and feedbacks on climate, so albedo and surface energy balance. Hydrology, obviously deeply affected by large-scale shifts from forests to other vegetation types. Plant and animal communities, this site here is no longer habitat for forest obligate birds, but maybe lark sparrows will do well. And then human and social and economic values also at stake here. And I just want to point out that, from a purely scientific or ecological point of view, these changes aren't necessarily good or bad. Fundamentally, that depends on our values. And in some cases, we might see changes that improve particular ecosystem services from our point of view. In other cases, we'll see changes that decrease the capacity of those ecosystems to provide those services. So we can also think about conversion as a more general and widespread concern. Our focus here, of course, forests and fire. But fire isn't the only thing that drives these changes, and it's happening in other systems. Great example are sagebrush systems, where we're seeing shifts towards non-native species associated with warming and invasion of those species, and also altered fire regimes subsequently. So some of you all may have been participants in our survey. We did a big survey a couple years ago, asking researchers and managers across the Western US about their perceptions of type conversion, and basically found abundant perceptions of conversion across a range of different vegetation types and multiple causes. So if you look at this graphic here, this is from 300 respondents. Fire certainly tops the list of potential drivers of conversion, but also climate and non-native species high on the list as well. And insects, other factors, which are a whole suite of things. And I also just want to point out that of those 300 respondents, about 10 were saying, well, they weren't really seeing that where they were working. So thanks to those of you who did take that survey, and also for both the Southwest and Southern Rockies Fire Science Exchanges for helping get that out to folks. This is just another paper I wanted to quickly highlight that just came out earlier this month. Drought is a potential global driver of forest conversion. So Enrique Batlori et al. Looked at 131 sites across the world, extratropical, so looking at temperate and boreal forests, and basically patterns of ecosystem response following drought, and their conclusions were that in only 21% of those sites was the dominant species clearly recovering. This is short term, so we don't know the duration of these changes, but shifts to alternate tree species were observed in 40 of those sites, shrubs in 29, and shifts towards non-woody vegetation in 10% of those sites. And so we can also anticipate moving forward, we'll likely see more of these changes incurred by other disturbances that can remove, wholesale intact forest canopy and kind of force the system to reorganize. So what options do we have? In particular, I want to think about what options we have for managing these systems moving forward into this era where, certainly all of the best science we have suggests we will see a lot more of these very dramatic changes moving forward into the future. So I want to kind of, this part of the talk will be, fairly high level, or 30,000 per perspective, rather than particular management strategies or particular interventions. Just sort of what's a framework we might utilize to move forward. And we've sort of moved to advocating for this particular framework, the RAD framework, which stands for resisting, accepting, or directing change. And it's based on this paper by Applet and Cole from 2010. And really, we can think about these as, three fundamentally different types of responses that would entail different interventions and different strategies, or lack thereof, as we move forward into this era of pronounced and accelerating change. So I'm going to describe each of those in a little bit of detail, but I wanted to ground them all in this particular landscape where I've done a lot of work. This is an area that was burned in 2011 by a fire called the Las Conchas fire in northern New Mexico. And it's an area that I grew up and I've spent a lot of time in. Like I said, just wanted to kind of ground this stuff in this particular landscape. You can see it's been pretty dramatically altered by fire. Okay, so resisting change. We could think about sort of objectives, and then what we know, knowledge applications, and then some of the knowledge needs and uncertainties associated with each of these strategies. So our objectives for resisting change might be to just increase ecological resistance, make a more fire-resistant forest. Might be to promote recovery mechanisms. So that could be, active replanting, or restoring altered systems to try and best position them to do those things on their own moving forward in the future. So restoring historic fire regimes, for example. We've done a lot of this work. This is, certainly the basis of most land management paradigms, certainly on public lands in Western North America. And a lot of this work has been done in these former frequent fire forest types like southwestern ponderosa pine forests. So we know a lot about fuels reduction methods, benefits of prescribed fire, resource benefit, wildfire, whatever we want to call it now. A lot of new work focusing on spatial heterogeneity and the benefits of heterogeneity in landscape resilience, and some work on this concept of refugia and applying the refugia concept to fire and other disturbances. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then, of course, replanting. There's been a lot of work done. Now, that's not to say there's still a lot of knowledge that we have yet to gain about those topics. So some needs and uncertainties associated with these. I think one thing I mentioned was a lot of this work's been done in frequent fire forests, but how applicable are these techniques to other forest types where, thinning might really be outside of the ecological, historic range of ecological forest structure. So I think there's a lot of work to do there. How do we maximize the effectiveness? I think this is always an important question for land management, especially in an era where we certainly don't have the resources and support that we need in order to do the work that needs to be done. And then finally, what is the capacity of these resistance strategies under continuing and accelerating changes? So at some of these trailing edge sites Sean talked about, is it really worth investing in trying to keep those forests there? I just wanted to use refugia as one example. Of course, there are many others. This is just one that I know about, but just thinking about that lost conscious landscape where we have only about 25% of that landscape left in a forested state. But we know that those forested patches are likely to be incredibly important in promoting any of the recovery of those forest systems moving forward into the future. And so we can also broaden that concept to other types of disturbances. And we know that, if we look under climate change scenarios, changing fire regimes, insect outbreaks, that they're understanding where on the landscape these forest systems might persist in spite of that may be critical to their long-term conservation. Refugia are also interesting, and they sort of link these concepts of resistance and resilience. So these are areas where they're somewhat, for whatever reason, resistant to disturbance or change. And of course, that provides the capacity for landscapes to recover elsewhere because these can serve as seed sources. But given what's coming, is resistance futile, right? I just taking a look at this, Sean showed a similar graph, global temperature projections under these different RCP scenarios. I just want to point out that we are down here where, we've seen about just around 1 degree Celsius global average warming. Of course, that translates to a little more at the latitudes and inside continents where we live. But we're still way down there, and we're already seeing a lot of change. Is at a certain point, resistance may not be a good strategy, right? And then another question is, how do you make a system resilient to permanent change? Resilience means the capacity of a system to bounce back after change. But if we're talking about 4 degrees of Celsius warming for the next several thousand years, we really may not be able to engineer resilience into these systems. So I don't want to say it's futile. I just want to say I think we need to be strategic and deliberate in how and when we apply these strategies, and then still be trying to learn, how likely are they to be successful over long time frames. So if we can't keep things the way they are, then we have two choices: accepting change, whatever happens, happens, or directing change, trying to help shape the outcome of change. As far as accepting change goes, I think it's basically just allowing things to unfold as they will, and then just how do we adapt society to whatever those outcomes are, right? There's a lot of knowledge that we have about maybe changes during the historical or paleoecological record. So we can generate some projections, and Sean alluded to many of these studies, as to how things might unfold essentially in the absence of direct intervention. But there's still an incredible amount of uncertainty there. As far as, I just listed non-stationarity, species migration rates, novel communities, interactions, dynamics under future climates. And then another really big one there is, what is our adaptive capacity? How much change can we handle before it starts to have really strong negative effects on human societies, right? As a recreationalist, it's pretty easy to adapt to riding a mountain bike in a forest versus a shrubland, but the timber industry is in a little different position, right? And of course, the species that depended on those systems are in a little bit of a different position as well, right? So just to return to this lost conscious example here, where might we just accept change? So I'm just going to flip through a few examples here. These are areas of high elevation mountain grassland that were invaded by trees due to fire suppression over the period of basically the 20th century. And then a lot of that area, when it burned in the lost conscious fire, actually flipped it back to grassland. So that might be a place where you'd say, hey, this fire actually restored the kinds of systems that were there before, and we would accept that. And maybe we'd say, some of us would say that's a positive, outcome of this fire. Another example, if you look right above Los Alamos there to the left on the map, if you look at those burn severity colors, you'll see a lot more yellow and green there. That area was burned during the Cerro Grande fire. A lot of there was cooked pretty good in 2000. And when Las Conchas rolled down the mountain and basically had Los Alamos right in its bullseye, that area basically served as to some extent as a fire break. And there's a great study by Matt Thompson from 2018. And basically they make the case that if it wasn't for that Cerro Grande fire, which was an unmitigated disaster at the time, Las Conchas probably would have done far worse things to that community. So having a large treeless area around your community might be, you know, another place we would say, hey, actually that was a net positive, right? And then finally, just showing the headwaters or the upper part of Frijoles Canyon here. This is an area that no matter what, it's unlikely, you know, it's a wilderness and it's steep and rocky. And this is probably the kind of place people will just, you know, by default, just logistically say, you know, well, this is kind of place where things are just going to unfold as they will. So finally, directing change. I think this is where we have probably the most need and opportunity, and also where we have to be very cautious about moving forward. And so objectives here would be to maintain particular ecosystem goods and services, particular values. And I think we have a lot of knowledge, yet we also have some very large needs and uncertainties. What is the possible range of ecosystem states at any given site? What is our capacity to really affect those or instate the kinds of systems that we do want? And of those, which do we select and why? And I think we have, I don't know if ethically we're quite where we need to be making the kinds of decisions that we are necessarily stuck with at this point. And finally, do managers even really have the social license? And if not, who is to provide that license? Okay, just one example of a project from this Los Conchas landscape. This is a really cool, it's called Climate Smart Reforestation After Severe Fire, developed by Colin Haffey and Ann Bradley at the Nature Conservancy of New Mexico. And this is work that I just want to credit Jen Stevens with doing a lot of the planning and groundwork here. This is a manuscript in prep also. But the objective is to reforest portions of this landscape, but not just with the species that were there before, where they you know, their current range, but also in their future modeled bioclimate niches. So maybe we won't have the same forests as we had before, but instead of a, you know, mixed conifer forest at higher elevations, we still might have the capacity for a ponderosa pine forest moving forward. So that's you know, the topic of assisted migration will necessarily be a big one, I think, moving forward into the future. And this is just one project that I think does a nice job, at least in providing options, let's say, for this landscape moving forward. So maybe ponderosa is still a good fit, but maybe some of these other species at lower elevations, maybe pinon juniper, will be, you know, more appropriate in some of these areas where there was ponderosa previously. Okay, I recognize I'm running into noon here, but I just have a couple more slides. How do managers and researchers think we should manage for conversion? Again, this comes from our survey. And I just want to point out that, you know, we offered folks never, rarely, under some circumstances, under most circumstances, and always as you know, options as to whether we should intervene or not, and what kind of intervention might be suitable. So the gray bar there represents under some circumstances. You can see the no intervention, prevent conversion, facilitate return to previous types, adapt to new types, and promote change. I think everyone recognizes almost that under some circumstances, any of these might be the appropriate strategy. The one that's interesting there is direct change, promote change to new types. I think you can see that green bar there rarely is a little higher than in the others. So that just suggests that that's still, you know, something that I think there is necessarily some trepidation about. But this is probably the one that we need to be thinking a lot more about. So folks are generally open to a wide range of management options in era of change, but managers do need social license to do things differently, and of course, just support and resources to do things, period. 4 key themes that we identified for science needs for decision-making around conversion. This is my almost ultimate slide. Characterizing vulnerability of fire-driven conversion, and Sean pointed out a lot of really great work that's being done and recently been done trying to characterize that vulnerability. But there's still a lot, I think, that we don't fully know. Providing plausible scenarios of post-fire ecological futures under shifting climate and fire regimes. And so, you know, what is likely to happen at some of these areas, and if they do convert, what will the ecological outcome of that be? Assessing the feasibility of directing or resisting conversion. So, no matter how much we try, are we likely to be successful at keeping things the way they are, or shifting them towards, a state that we've decided that we can live with? And then finally, really understanding the social ecological consequences of these choices to resist, accept, or direct change. And we argue that all of this stuff is best addressed using a co-production model. And so researchers working in partnership with managers and also stakeholders in communities and the public at large, these are going to be very difficult decisions. And they are, we're going to be necessarily doing things differently than the way that we are used to doing things right now. And so bringing as many people to the table as possible, and making sure that whatever we do, we consider it as a science experiment as well as a management experiment. We can at least learn from it, whether or not we think ultimately that it was a success or failure. I think this is going to be really the only path that I can see to navigate what promises to be a fairly challenging future. So just a quick re-acknowledgement of our hosts for the webinar, our many collaborators on this project, and the many funding organizations, institutions, and individuals that supported all of the research that we've discussed here. Also, just shout out to the Landscape Ecology Association for Landscape Ecology. A lot of this work was catalyzed by a special session we had there. And with that, I think we have time. We're eating into some people's lunch hours here, but Sean and Camille and I certainly will stick around and entertain whatever questions you might have.
Yeah, first off, I want to thank all the presenters. I think this is, for me, I really appreciate walking through the whole story. And so it's great to get all three of you to take the different parts and really think about the science, the management, the sort of setting, and getting some understanding of that. We have some questions coming in the chat window, and I'll share those in just a second. And I want to encourage all the participants to add questions to the chat window. We can also unmute some lines if you want to ask a question out loud. And I also, as we're moving into questions, I want to share a poll. We're just sort of tracking how we're doing on some of these webinars and things. So if you just take a second to fill that out while you're thinking or listening to some of these questions, I'd appreciate it. And we'll start with the questions that have come in so far. But again, please do add your questions. And I know a few folks on the attendee list. So if we don't get enough questions, I'm going to be calling people out. So get your questions in now. So early on, we had a question about the Hayman fire from John Walker, who asked whether the Hayman fire burn scar affected or enhanced the urban water supplies because of the reduction in canopy cover, presumably.
I don't have a perfect answer for that. Perhaps somebody else does. I know that it changed the water quality and has continued to change the water quality. In terms of like total flow, I haven't seen those numbers lately. I think you're right in your thinking that as we lose the forest cover, we've probably had an increase, at least in pulses of water. Whether that's a continual addition throughout the year, I think is a different story. But if somebody else has something to add, please go ahead.
I'm not seeing Jonathan or Sean jump in, so maybe we'll move on to another question more focused on the refugia and the idea of maybe resisting or directing change a little bit. And that's a real tactical question around, is there any evidence that retardant drops during a wildfire might contribute to the survival of refugia? And I don't know if any of you feel like you can weigh in on that or maybe point to other resources.
Well, I'll weigh in and say I don't know of any evidence, but I think that would be a really cool thing to look at. And certainly, you know, those of us who are working on with this refugium concept are advocating for management for the generation of refugia pre-fire and during incident management, as well as maintenance of these things on a landscape post-fire. And so if you have the opportunity to call in some drops to try and save some little patches of forest, and you give me those GPS locations, I'd be happy to follow up with you and make that a cool little study we could do down the road.
Great.
I know that I think Dave Calkin and his group and Kit O'Connor are really concerned about retardant drops. And one of the problems they have is actually getting accurate, basically GPS locations of them. But they might have some information for you. So that's just some other research to look into.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And that sounds like, as both of you just hinted at, a good avenue for co-production where researchers will need to be partnering with on-the-ground managers to really get that work done and to understand. And so, yeah, good example. Let me try to pick out some other questions here. John Walker also pointed out that Jonathan, I think, made the point about the Las Conchas opening up large areas of treeless grass around Los Alamos, and that maybe having a positive effect based on Matt Thompson's paper. But John Walker makes the point that the large treeless burn scar did not save Paradise, California, and may actually proved worse because of the rapid rate of spread through grass. So I think that goes to this point that the local ecology and local conditions make a big difference. I don't know if anybody wants to add on to that idea. No, okay. Let's see. William says, well, actually, let me note about the recording here first. So a couple people have asked about the recording, and Gloria highlighted that we'll post the recording both on frames.gov as well as the Southern Rockies Fire Science Network YouTube channel. And we'll at least have a link on the Southwest Fire Science Consortium website and YouTube channel. So it'll be available as soon as we can, hopefully by Monday morning, if you have colleagues who missed this but would benefit from it. Now moving on to William Lee's comment or question here. I guess it's a question. William says, ever the optimist as we see the overall trend of replacement of timber by non-timber overstory at lower elevations and latitude, do we ever see the opposite trend at high elevations and latitudes?
I'll take that. There's some evidence of that occurring, basically encroachment into upper elevations or alpine areas. But I would say that the models do suggest that would happen, right? We suggest that as these barren alpine rocky areas become more climatically suitable to trees, they should start, in theory at least, to start to, support trees. There are problems, however, with soils. There's not a whole lot of soils up there, so the rate at which there might be, say, forest moving into alpine areas is probably, I would guess, is going to be slower than the rate at which we might be losing forests at the lower elevations, and partially because the idea that forest is this kind of abrupt catalyst, and tree encroachment into the alpine areas is going to be a slower process. So, but the models do say it should happen. So I would expect that to happen over decades to centuries.
Yeah, and if I could just chime in there on Sean's answer, I think if we were to fast forward for a million or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years, certainly those are the kinds of changes we expect. But there's just this incredible disparity in the rates of forest loss versus rates of forest establishment. Even under the best case scenarios, to have a 200-year-old forest that a site would take 200 years, but that's completely impossible when you don't have seed sources present for that forest. And also these high latitude, high elevation systems just operate very, very slowly compared to these more productive lower elevations and latitudes. So over a long time frame, we would expect some sort of equilibrium to be achieved, but over the time frames of the next several centuries, we're going to see incredibly rapid losses of forest systems there's no way they will be balanced by any increases in forests in some of these other areas. I just said the same thing as Sean, basically. I just want to say it again. So because I do think it's an important point to recognize that difference in rates is just orders and orders of magnitude.
Just one more point is just the way mountains work, they're pointed like this. The area at the top of a mountain is just less than the area at the base of a mountain. So even if you do see, forests moving up into the alpine areas, just there's a geometry issue in that it will not be equal gain for equal loss.
Yes, that all makes sense. I appreciate William struggling to remain optimistic. Let's see, another comment came in kind of touching back on the water quality. Maren Chambers comments that her understanding of the talking with Denver watershed scientists is that the Hayman fire has had many problems with ongoing erosion and water quality issues, which has impacted the water provision to urban Denver. So just kind of continuing that train of thought. And we have another question that came in about the impacts of forest conversion on materials in aquatic environments, and kind of building on some of this water connection from the upper to lower elevation. Any of you presenters want to dig into that a little bit?
Definitely not me. I don't know what allocothonous materials are.
I couldn't even pronounce it, so I skipped it. Ashley, I think we may be out of our depth on that one, but if you wanted to unmute your line and kind of expand on that, you're welcome to do that as well.
Yeah, so allochthonous materials are the materials that come in from outside, usually from like trees falling in, like that kind of debris. Then autolochthonous is the materials that are already in the waterways. So I just didn't know if you guys knew of any impacts that would maybe occur from like a different species of trees that would happen with the aquatic environment.
Yeah, I would just suspect, I'm just going to posit any of that stuff is basically short-lived in terms of, the longer time frames. There's a lot of, the idea of forest loss has very long-term implications, right? If it's, it might be good in the short term for some some birds and what have you, or certain species to have a burnt forest. But if that forest doesn't come back, or comes back as something else, you can see the associated species will change a lot. And so I'm just going to say that the allochthonous materials would definitely increase, but it's probably, a temporary overall, because if forest doesn't come back, there's no trees to replace those as they get decomposed or washed away.
And I would just add to, I think back to, Maren Chambers' comment, that I think what's really striking in some of these converted landscapes is that they're continuing to lose soil, continuing to have erosion issues. We're talking 15 plus years after these fires, which are certainly going to impact those aquatic communities beyond just like the woody debris placement that probably happened more immediately after that fire, at least in terms of like a huge woody debris load into that aquatic environment.
That's a great point. We've had two questions come in on the social license aspect. And so one is ideas about how to promote social license. How do we build societal trust and empowerment folks to experiment with different management strategies. And maybe I'll just add the other question on so we can sort of just open up the discussion of social license. Can you discuss more about social license and what it would look like in a perfect world? Communicate gaps with the public that would be ideal to overcome to make way for proactive management or lack of management if it's warranted. So if any of you want to venture into that, I think there's some interest there.
Well, I'd be happy to offer my perspective, and then I do think this is a great sort of general discussion topic, and it'd be great to hear from other folks as well. And just speaking locally, you know, we have some projects here that with the GMUG National Forest, where we have what's called an adaptive management group that brings together, you know, all the different stakeholders from, you know, the most diehard environmentalists to timber industry to ranching to parks and wildlife, so our wildlife, you know, management, and then with independent science team. And I feel like, at least here, I really value that approach, and I value that we have the capacity for, you know, to bring all these different people to the table, discuss the issues, discuss pros and cons, and try and work out differences that people have so that ultimately we can have projects where even if everyone's not in agreement, they understand, you know, sort of the impetus for the projects, and they can, you know, there is some level of transparency. And I think that sort of thing is really valuable, in particular because, you know, in this increasingly politicized or polarized political climate that we live in, you know, having local stakeholders who you know can all come together at the same table and talk about timber sale project, and you know, talk about climate change impacts on forests, and I think that can be incredibly valuable. So certainly, you know, and as well as having regular public outreach from that group to the you know, to the local communities at least. So I'm a big believer in that approach from what I've seen here. I think there has to be that local level of involvement, and just, you know, bringing folks to the table. But I would really love to hear what others think as well, about that piece, because I do think it's going to be increasingly important moving forward. You know, how do you get the public involved in the public lands management in this time of, you know, just total increasing craziness?
I would add too, I think that I think burned landscapes, you know, that are experiencing or have the potential to experience these conversions are, you know, ripe for us to like experiment with, or, you know, have a little bit more social license in part because we have for so long thought about these landscapes, these burned landscapes as, you know, well, now they're terrible, or, you know, something like that, that they're no good. And so I think that it's a lot harder to get people on board, like to change the species composition, or, you know, do some really heavy management action on a forest that somebody is connected to. But when you have these like really large burned landscapes, you know, that people are intimately connected to already. Like I think about the fires that have happened here in Colorado this year. Like I get questions all the time from people about what we do about them now that they've happened. And I think this, you know, in some ways provides us the opportunity for those discussions and for that community involvement in meeting those, you know, like creating those values and landscapes that we want to try to achieve anyway.
Yeah, Camille, that's great. I'd also say that I feel like there should be a greater acceptance of failure, I guess, or a license to fail. You know, we're entering uncharted territories, and we're all afraid to fail, but we need to try things, right? And society, and we all just need to understand that, you know, everyone's doing their best. So this idea of a license to fail as part of the social license might be a good idea, because we can learn from failures, right? I mean, it's, as Camille was talking about, you know, experimentation. And so we can do some experiments, and if certain actions don't work out, then we know that, right?
That's a great point. Maybe this is a good opportunity to let folks unmute and contribute if they want to the verbal conversation around social license. I think this is a pretty important aspect or kind of follow on from the research you guys have presented today. Well, maybe we'll touch on one other question here, sort of as we're waiting, or as people are building the courage to unmute. Scott had a question about soil. It's water question, but involving soil. To what extent is the formation of hydrophobic soil after high severity fire a limiting factor for seedling establishment? And what are the treatments or processes that can counteract this?
Jonathan, you know about this, right? No, okay. I have no experience in this, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think this is an area that we don't really have a great sense of, you know, and I also don't have a ton of experience in this area, but a lot of times, you know, as vegetation scientists, we go into these landscapes years after the fire event, and so we don't have good knowledge of like, oh, this site had you know, burned much more intensely and had much higher proportion of hydrophobic soils, or lost this amount of soil. So I feel like that's not something that's often included in like tree regeneration studies, though I do think it's probably important.
Yeah, and I think like many of the topics you discussed today, I think it's an area of expanding research, and there unfortunately more places where this comes up for discussion. I know that Anne Bradley, who Jonathan mentioned some of her work, but she's been leading the Burned Area Learning Network in trying to share some experience around this sort of topic. And we will be having some webinars trying to share best practices. I'm not sure directly on this issue, but certainly on things like planting. And I'd also point to Dr. Owen Burney at New Mexico State University, who's done a lot of seedling work. I think by the time you're actually planting seedlings, hydrophobicity is really less of a concern than paying for the expense of getting someone out there and planting trees. But I guess I'm just making the point that there are folks looking at some of these issues, and it's going to be a bigger and bigger topic as we think about reforesting some of these high severity areas. Let's see, my screen is freezing up here, as typical. You can never get through these things totally unscathed. So I can't quite tell if more questions have come in the chat window, or if there's anything else you presenters would like to add as we wind down here.
Well, there's a question about private versus state versus federal land and fire and fire severity, and whether or not I guess fire burns differently on different land classes. And I'd say there's a couple studies out there that do look at that, but I think they're overall case studies and can't be generalized over the entire, say, Western US or even you're asking about the Midwest. But I think that would be an interesting area of study for sure. You know, the type of logging and the type of post-logging activities have a huge effect, right? If you thin and burn, generally that does reduce fire, the next fire that come around, the fire intensity. But there's, the Tillamook fire in Oregon was, I think prior to this year, might have been the biggest fire in Oregon. That burned through logging slash, but that, that was kind of outdated logging practices. So I think there's a lot of ifs, ands, or buts, and it depends on the logging, and in particular the post logging activities. So more research, I guess, is needed on that.
Hey Xander, this is Doug. Thanks for letting me in. I just one question or a comment on the social license. In New Mexico, we recently put some fair bit of work into a prescribed fire bill, and before the legislature this in January, they'll be hopefully discussing, debating this prescribed fire bill. And so one of the pitches, of course, with prescribed fire is, hey, it's a restoration tool, but kind of based on the message we heard here today, you can almost see like more maybe urgency in the sense of like, well, this is actually a resilience tool, or pardon me, a resistance tool. So I think now it's like, oh, we have all these acres, we can put prescribed fire wherever we need to get more prescribed fire on the ground, and there's plenty of opportunity for that. And maybe in other words, in the future, you can see, well, there's fewer and fewer opportunities. Like we're just, it's kind of like the putting a fire retardant on refugia, right? It's like, so and the point is, it'd be an interesting messaging to legislators and others, like, in other words, like, as opposed to a restoration tool, it's kind of, we're building on this resistance. So maybe helping build some more urgency, if that's even possible.
Yeah, thank you, Doug. And looking at the time, maybe this is a good place to wind down. And I want to thank all three of our presenters again. Not the most, a little depressing, but I think I always feel like knowing that the challenges we're facing, to the point Doug Cram just made, maybe increases our urgency. And certainly for those of us working in this field, underscores the importance of our efforts. So thank you all. I really appreciate your time today. Thanks to all the participants for joining in, and we'll have that recording out to share with your other colleagues as soon as possible.
Thanks.
Thanks all.
Yeah, thanks everybody for watching. Catch y'all later.